That's interesting. And so, for someone who's maybe new to this concept of vocation and glorifying God through their vocation, maybe they're struggling to understand this. And they say, I can understand how my worship on Sunday is glorifying to God, and maybe how my devotion time or our family worship time is glorifying to God. But how's my work as a healthcare provider? How is that glorifying to God? Can you explain the theology and the biblical grounding behind this just a little bit more for those who this is new, they're trying to wrap their minds around it?
I will. So if we want to do the theological things for a little bit, let's go all the way back to Genesis, where we're kind of getting the master plan for human life, and some of the neat things that happen, very gospel presentation things at the very beginning of the Bible are first, we as humans, we get our label before we do any labor. So before Adam and Eve are called to tend the garden, we are told that they are made in the image of God. That is, they're made to reflect the glory of God, His character and characteristics. Now that's important because it means they have value to God before they do any work at all. In other words, our value comes before our performance. Now that's a great gospel concept, right? That we have a vocation to be reflecting God before we've done it well. And God has blessed us, called us His own, identified us as something that can bring Him glory, reflect His character before we've done anything. But then we recognize that the labor that Adam and Eve do, they are called to do to keep and tend and steward the aspects of the garden. The labor comes before the fall. Sometimes we think that work is just drudgery, awful things, mow down the weeds, push back the darkness and the thorns and the thistle and all that stuff. But remember that before the weeds and the thistle and the bad things came into the world, work was already given. So work was not a bad thing. It's something that people who have God's image do to carry out the purposes of God, to carry out the glory of God. And so you asked for the theological answer, and maybe that's going too far back, but it's really saying the work is intended to steward God's purposes in the world. And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes you just think this is a terrible, awful job. Well, it can be an awful job because it's a broken world. And so as we're trying to make progress for God in a broken world, there are hard things to do. There are dirty and difficult things to do. There are difficult people to work for. There are difficult people to work with. But if we are stewarding God's gifts in the work that we do, we are actually multiplying the purposes of God in the world in the work that we do. And I know, Aaron, sometimes you were asking, how do we perceive that? I always encourage people, if you would see how important your job is, and you think it's just an awful, menial, insignificant thing, you can always do the George Bailey test. So if you think back to that old movie, It's a Wonderful Life, and remember the angel Clarence is trying to get his wings. I'm not defending this theology. This is not the theological portion of this interview. Right? But remember, Clarence is trying to get his wings. So he lets George Bailey, who's terribly depressed, see what the world would be like if he had not lived. Mm-hmm. So he gets to see if it were the impact of his absence. And I couldn't help but think about that some years ago when I was actually asked to visit a cheese factory out on the northwest coast of the States. And I watched, and on the assembly line there was a man who stood, and his whole job was to watch these little blocks of cheese go by, by the hundreds or thousands, and every 10th block of cheese he would straighten it a little bit, so that block of cheese would rightly go into the packages that would seal it. And, I'm kind of thinking to myself, man, I'm glad I don't have that job. That I don't think I would feel fulfilled. Now, I know nothing about the man, his talents, his gifts, his obligations, but I have to think, what if he weren't doing that? What if he were not straightening the cheese so it goes into the packaging? So the package doesn't properly seal. So bacteria enters the packaging, so that somebody gets sick, so that the product gets a bad reputation, so that not only is the man who got sick not able to provide for his family, but people don't buy the cheese, and so the company goes broke, and therefore the people who are working don't have jobs, and therefore because they don't have jobs, their families can't be provided for. And you kind of go through all that domino effect, and you think, man, but by him being faithful in his work, even if it's hard work, even if he doesn't like the work, if he's faithful in his work, he's protecting and promoting not just the purposes of the company, he's protecting the people of God and promoting the purposes of God in their life. And if you can kind of step back and do that George Bailey test, if I didn't do that, what would happen? Then he begins to see how his work, when faithfully does, brings glory to God. Gerard Manley Hopkins, that wonderful Christian poet, years and years ago, he once wrote this. He said, "To lift up hands in prayer gives glory to God. But a man with a dung fork in his hand, or a woman with a slop pail, gives him glory too. God is so great that all things give him glory if we mean that they should." If the reason that I'm doing this job is because I want to show by my efforts, maybe even by my endurance, my patience, whatever, if I want people to see some aspect of the character of God to promote his purposes, then everything that we do gives him glory if we mean that it should. And that's why our work is worship and our vocation, our calling.